Our topic for today, as you know, is making relationship work. I have to confess, I was originally inspired to do this talk because of the story of a couple who was engaged decades ago, broke off their engagement, lived separate lives, had kids, and reconnected a few years ago. Then they got married a short time later. And anyone who knows me knows that I am just a true romantic. I am a sucker for a good love story. It is one of my all-time favorite things in the world when you can just tell that two people are over the moon for each other. I love the giddiness. I love the way eyes lock. I love physical closeness. I love the way people can be in a crowded space and you look at them and you know that they feel like they're the only two people in the room. There's something in my heart, and I think in all of our hearts, that can't help but leap when you see people who have found that kind of love. It's the magical dream that we're all looking for here. It's what all the songs are about. Maybe not all the songs, but it's what a lot of the songs are about, what a lot of our movies are about, what all the dating sites are about. It's what all the weddings are about. And just as our hearts soar when we see this kind of love in the world, our hearts sink a bit when it doesn't work out. And that's what happened recently when I heard through the grapevine that this couple who reconnected after all of these years is having problems and may not make it. There's a sinking feeling when we hear things like that, a jadedness that comes along with it because we've heard these stories a million times. And of course, we've all been there ourselves. We've all been in relationships that started out with so much love, so much hope and potential for something truly harmonious and mutually supportive, where you and the other person are committed to the same goals. That feeling of magic connection is there. And then it all just starts to slowly fall apart, or it just shatters altogether. And I'm talking about romantic love here, but I'm talking about romantic love in part because that's usually our most intense study in relationship. But we know that this happens also in our friendships. Friendships fall apart, family dynamics are challenging, work colleagues, the relationships die, all of it. If you live long enough, it's easy to see that everyone's lives are full of what Robert likes to call bodies in the road. You've probably heard the saying that when you pull enough people out of a drowning river, at some point you have to go upstream and find out what's pushing them into the water in the first place. And at some point, I think we have to ask ourselves the same thing when it comes to relationships, both personally and collectively. How are we so routinely in this place where things start out with so much potential and then end up as a total dumpster fire? How come, whether it's our lives, our friends' lives, our businesses, our schools, our politics, our study groups, etc., how come it seems like no one can get along? Why does this keep happening to us time and time again? And so now the question becomes, what is in the water of our culture? What's in the water of our world, even in our own nature, that is making us people who cannot hold relationships together? And how can we right that ship? And we should want to right that ship. Relationships are everything to us here. They are our source of love. They give our lives purpose and meaning. They're our support system. We experience our greatest learning and growth in relationship with each other. Relationships can be the greatest joy that we have in our lives. And of course, if we don't get it right, they can also be our greatest source of pain. When we keep failing at relationship, or if we're stuck in this cycle of sustained conflict, there is a jadedness that sets in. There's an anger and a bitterness that sets in. We lose trust and we withdraw, we become afraid of people, and then we're lonely, which is what we're seeing everywhere in the world right now. There's an epidemic of loneliness. And so, in looking to conventional wisdom for how we can get along, I found an article from one of the top wellness websites called 9 Rules for Making Relationship Work. And I want to share these rules with you because I think they're fairly reflective of the kind of contemporary advice we get when it comes to relationships, whether it's from the web, whether it's from our friends, or even from therapists. And so, what I'd like to do is I'd like to read you these 9 things twice. And the first time I read it, I want you to hold up a finger if you agree that this is something that will make relationship work. You don't have to be public with it unless you want to. You don't have to show us your hands, but I want you to keep count of how many fingers you have up. Okay. So hold up a finger if you agree that accepting conflict as normal is a key part of making relationship work. Hold up a finger if growing yourself up emotionally is key to making relationship work. Hold up a finger if you think giving each other space is key to making relationship work. Developing an I'm awesome attitude, knowing your worth. Hold up a finger if you think taking care of your own needs is key to making relationship work. See a lot of fingers here. Communicating boundaries. Never rewarding bad behavior. Heeding the wisdom of your internal voice. Flooding the relationship with affection. So if you're really brave, you're invited to put your number in the chat. How many of those statements did you agree with? So now I'm going to go through the list again, and I want you to hold up a finger if you agree that the point is other oriented, meaning if the point is something that is focused on caring about the other person's feelings, needs, and their worth. Accepting conflict as normal. Growing yourself up emotionally. Giving each other space. Developing an I'm awesome attitude. Taking care of your own needs. Communicating boundaries. Never rewarding bad behavior. Heeding the wisdom of your internal voice. And flooding the relationship with affection. How many fingers do you have up now? Maybe one. The last rule is about flooding the relationship with affection. But even if we include that one, there's the question of how much affection can possibly get through all of those boundaries and all that space and all that personal awesomeness. The point of this exercise is not to say that the rules on that list are wrong or that they don't have a place. They do. The point of the exercise is for us to think about how much of the advice that we receive about relationship is actually self-focused. How much of that advice are we subtly or overtly going along with in ways that have the effect of making our relationship self-focused? And what is the result of all of that? If our relationships have become mostly about us, then what happens to true joining? One result is that when you zoom out and actually look at the world, what you find is that we have millions of little self-victories each day that add up to the end result of relationships that don't work, and often with tragic consequences. We all want love. We all love those love stories. We're hardwired for it. And so why is it that we're always seeking love while at the same time creating and celebrating the conditions that make love impossible? Naturally, A Course in Miracles has something to say about all of this. And while there's an infinite number of ways to approach a topic like how to make relationship work, from a course perspective, I want to answer this question today by sharing with you the one thing that will kill relationship every time. This is something that we all do to some degree, but it's also something that the more we do it, the more we are guaranteed to torpedo any relationship that we're in. And the thing that we do that will kill our relationships every time is listening to the ego's voice. Now, you might be thinking, I already know that. Of course, I know that. I'm a course student. But we really don't have an appreciation for just how much the ego is ruining our relationships. We just don't understand how once the ego comes out of the box, it has a way of becoming our unquestioned authority. And the result of that will always be that piling up of the long string of bodies in the road. The Course says every response to the ego is a call to war, which means that listening to the ego will always lead us to waging war, even against those we love, sometimes especially against those we love. And if we really understood that, our culture wouldn't be joined in clever tips for how the ego can get its way. Our friends wouldn't be joined in reinforcing that ego voice in us. Rather, we would all be joined in thinking the ego is the problem and doing everything we can to get rid of it. And so, with that in mind, I want to spend the rest of the talk today going through 4 phases that cover what happens to our relationships when we listen to the ego's voice and how we would respond differently if we listen to the Holy Spirit instead. And as I go through these, one thing to keep in mind is that they're fluid. We can easily be moving back and forth from one phase to the other, depending on the relationship or the circumstance. But do keep in mind that one thing that will always be true is that the more you stay stuck in the first 2 phases, the more dysfunctional your relationships are going to be. So, phase 1 is where the ego's voice is completely in charge. There is no questioning the voice at all in this phase. You know that what you're thinking is not only true, but it is righteously true. In this phase, you are pouring a tremendous amount of negative attention and negative energy onto the other person or onto a situation that involves them. You know you're in this place when you're not even thinking about healing. And in fact, there's a destructiveness to your thinking and your behavior. The Course says the ego teaches that your function on earth is destruction. And so when you're in that place of like, let's just smash it, then you know you're in the first phase. You know you're in this place when you are just on the warpath. You know that you're in this place when you are totally right and they are totally wrong, when you can't trust anything that they say, when you're itching to get other people to join you in your blame. Just even listening to them feels like a betrayal of yourself. You feel like you have a right and even a duty to just let them have it. And as a result of all of this, you're in this place of merciless one-sidedness. You're the hero, they're the criminal. You need careful defense, they need a total takedown. Your needs are the priority, their needs are irrelevant. And they need to change while you are just fine. Hallmark phrases of the ego voice in phase 1 are how dare you? This has to be resolved immediately, and they cannot get away with this. Hallmark emotions of phase 1 are outrage, raw anger, mistrust, a lot of resentment and blame, and fierce, intense criticism. And finally, this phase also involves a lot of incessant rumination on the situation. You just can't let go of what they did. And so you keep spinning on it and spinning on it, how you can't believe what they said. You can't believe what they've done. And the end result of all of that spinning tends to be that things get blown way out of proportion. And so when you're in that place, any attempt to bring in a spiritual solution or spiritual tools gets completely rejected in phase one because you are listening to the ego exclusively. And when you're listening to the ego exclusively, there's no room for spiritual solutions or spiritual tools. In fact, the spiritual solutions appear to be an outrage in this phase because they're a distraction from the real problem, which is what the other person did and the way you were treated that you clearly didn't deserve. There is something very, very primal about this place. In chapter 5 of the text, the Course says the ego, quote, represents a delusional system and speaks for it. And so when you're in this place, everything that you're telling yourself, delusional as it may be, feels logical, rational even. And that's what makes this phase so dangerous because you're out of control and you don't even know it. But when we're in this place, we're like a little tear in the fabric of society. And the Course says that, quote, society depends on inhibiting the pull of human appetites, inhibiting the pull of this primal place. And we see what happens when people have no control over the ego's voice in them. We know it's true that if we just let that voice run wild, society would break down. If we're all just running around exclusively doing the bidding of our ego, obviously this would take a total wrecking ball to our world. And in fact, it's hard not to wonder if that's exactly what's happening right now. So this is where phase 2 comes in, because phase 2 is where you're actually able to inhibit the pull of human appetite. You still think the ego's voice in you is right, but you recognize its destructiveness. You know that just letting it have its way, letting it out is not going to work. And so you're able to put a lid on it. We all know this phase, and if we're honest, we spend a good portion of our lives in this place. We're not all hulked up, tearing down society. We're holding down a life, we're holding down a job, we're even holding down our relationships for the most part. We're able to control the ego's voice in us, but a hallmark of phase 2, and this is really important, is that we don't question the ego's voice in us. So we can control all of that primal outrage and anger. We can control that resentment and blame. But the one thing we won't do is to look at it and deeply challenge its validity. In fact, in this phase, what we're doing is we're doubling down on it. The good news, though, is that in phase 2, we're just beginning to put some space between ourselves and the problem, which is the ego's voice. But even so, the ego's voice is still running the show. The ego's voice is still in charge. You're just doing all that you can to keep the beast in the cage. On the outside, you are presenting an image that is calm and constructive, and that's definitely progress from phase 1. But again, on the inside, there's no part of you that is seriously questioning whether that voice in you is actually true. Instead, all of your energy is going to keeping that voice under wraps for the sake of peace. Phase 2, by the way, encompasses that space that Robert and I discussed early in the forgiveness challenge that we hosted recently. If you were part of that challenge, you may recall that we spoke about this conflict in our minds between what the world's reality says is true, which is that the other person has done this thing that has really hurt us, and what being good or being spiritual says, which is that we need to let it go. And so that push pull between seeing the other person as unforgivable and wanting to forgive at the same time takes up a lot of real estate in our mind. In chapter 14 of the course, it says we have, quote, alternating patterns of light and darkness and light that, quote, sweep constantly across our mind. But it goes on to say that the little sanity that still remains is held together by a sense of order which you establish. And so this is the important part. We're in that conflict in our mind. We're in that back and forth between light and darkness and light. But the Course says the very fact that you can do this, meaning the very fact that you can bring any order to chaos, shows that you are not an ego. And that more than an ego must be in you. For the ego is chaos. And if it were all of you, the Course says no order at all would be possible. So, in other words, the very fact that you can separate from the ego enough to impose any control over it at all demonstrates that you are not an ego. If you were, you wouldn't be able to separate from it at all. So, more than an ego must be in you. And therefore, you must be bigger than the ego. You must be stronger than the ego. You just have further to go. And that brings us to phase 3. Because phase 3 is where you're not only able to put some distance between you and the ego's voice, but you're actually able to put enough distance to see the ego for the truly insane, destructive thing that it is. You can see what it's doing. You can see that call to war. You can also see that the ego's perception is always distorted. It's not seeing reality. And you can see that it's hurting you. You can see that in the ego's call to war, you are always going to lose. So you need all 3 components that I just talked about before you can really let the ego's voice go. You need to see that it's hurting others. You need to see that it's not real. And you need to see that it's hurting you. Only when you have enough distance between you and your ego's voice to see these things will you at last become willing to let it go. The key to getting to this point is a commitment, a vigilance to watching your mind for the ego's voice. It requires a certain attentiveness at all times. It requires an awareness that the ego's voice is very tricky. The ego's voice loves to morph itself into sounding spiritual. It loves to sound like the voice for truth. It loves to sound righteous. It loves to sound like the voice of reason. And it loves to tell us that it's speaking for our authentic self. And so we need to be looking out for it. And we need to be watching in particular for the telltale characteristics of it. So I did a search in the CE app for phrases like ego says, ego tells, ego counsels, ego whispers. And while this isn't a complete list, there is a composite here of the ego's voice that emerges, and it can give us a start on things to watch out for. So we should all keep in mind that the ego's voice is harsh and strident and loud. It counsels attack always as a way to preserve itself. It searches for and it keeps in clear sight all the lacks that it can perceive in the other person. Compared to what you perceive in them, you're the one standing tall and stately and clean and honest, pure and unsullied. So, in other words, going back to that idea of they're always wrong and you're always right. And while you're standing tall and stately, it bids you to, quote, look upon your brothers and see the guilt in them. The ego's voice will tell you that you can escape from your distress by getting rid of the other person. That's a big one. And perhaps the most telltale sign of all of the ego's voice is that it shatters your peace. It also makes us realize, or calls us to realize, that it calls us into a sense of depression and a sense of unworthiness. And so when our mind is in these places, we know that we're in the ego's voice. And again, another thing that summarizes so much about the ego's voice is that ferocious one-sidedness, where our needs, our point, and our wounds are the only thing that matter in the situation. And if they're trying to introduce their needs, their points, their hurts, then it's merely a change of the subject. So in phase 3, we're able to say, there it is. That's the voice of my ego. And whereas before it looked like your white horse that you were going to climb on, now you're able to see the ego's voice for the monster that it is. So first you're watching out for it, and next you're willing to deeply question it. And part of being deeply willing to question your ego's voice is being willing to say, maybe I'm not the white knight here. Maybe I'm the aggressor in my own right. Maybe I'm bringing war for no good reason. Maybe I'm not seeing clearly here. Maybe the one-sidedness of my viewpoint is just the ego's customary distortion. Maybe there's more going on here than just me being the hero of my own story. Maybe the other person isn't totally guilty. Maybe I just want to see them that way. And then all of that will naturally lead you to a place where you're willing to at last think, maybe I'm shattering my own peace here. Maybe I'm sending myself into depression and a feeling of worthlessness. And maybe that sick feeling of stomach, a sick feeling of that I feel in my stomach is actually guilt for the lovelessness that I'm bringing. And only when we're able to see all of this are we at last willing to set the ego's voice aside, not to just keep it locked up or keep it buried in our subconscious, but to genuinely let it go. And that is what opens the way to our fourth and final step. But just as a quick recap, the first 3 phases have been all about the ego's voice. In phase 1, the ego's voice was totally in charge. In phase 2, you're able to keep a lid on it, but it's still your unquestioned point of view. In phase 3, you've spotted the ego's voice, you've deeply questioned it, and you've been willing to let it go. And when you are willing to let it go, this allows you to let in another voice, which of course is the Holy Spirit's. Throughout the course, we are told that there are only 2 voices that we can choose between. There's the ego's voice, and then there's the voice of the Holy Spirit. But you can only really let in the Holy Spirit's voice once you've renounced the ego's voice. Because when you try and act from the Holy Spirit's voice while you're still hanging on to the ego's voice, you just come across as sanctimonious and even condescending. It's the spiritual equivalent of the non-apology that we all love, where the person says, I'm so sorry that you feel that way. When you're trying to extend love from an ego place, it usually comes across like that. It usually comes across as some form of, well, I'm sorry that you're in your ego. And that doesn't feel like love. So, what happens when you are really coming from the voice of the Holy Spirit? Going all the way back to those 9 points that I started out with, the Holy Spirit's voice is extremely other-oriented. It sees the other person as God's beloved son, and so it treats them as infinitely worthy and precious. It acts as if they matter, and as if their needs matter, as if our needs are genuinely met by serving theirs. So, just as we looked at the characteristics of the ego's voice, I want to take you through a few characteristics of the Holy Spirit's voice. And as I read these to you, I'd like you to imagine what it would be like to have these questions and these statements at the top of your mind throughout a relationship, and especially in a situation of conflict. So, here's how the Holy Spirit is thinking about relationship with us and how we, in turn, can be thinking about relationship with other people. How can I be a healing influence on this person? How can I care for them in this process? How can they feel loved here? If they're attacking, I'm thinking those who attack are spiritually poor. Their poverty asks for the gift of love, not further attack. So, how can I love in the face of attack? How can I be defenseless, secure in my own worth, because I know I'm safe, and open to any amount of truth in what they have to say? How can I be gentle and realize that gentleness is actually my strength? How can I be a safe presence for them? How can I recognize that safety is the complete relinquishment of attack? And when we can do this, we recognize that it's impossible to have conflict in us in this space. We become wholly benign. And the Course says the perfectly safe are wholly benign. So the goal, in other words, is to teach only love, to demonstrate, as the Course says, that peace is stronger than war because peace is what heals war. This doesn't mean that you don't put forth the truth as you see it. It doesn't mean that you cede points that are valid or that you don't voice your disagreement. But it does mean that you don't try to overpower other people with judgment or argument or try and force them into seeing how wrong they are. You can still put forward your points, but you know you're listening to the Holy Spirit's voice when you recognize the main point here is always love. And of course, if you can do that, they will know that you are on their side. They will know that you are safe. And feeling safe, they will be far more open to what it is that you have to say. Now, I recognize that this is a very high bar. Robert and I have just been feeling the stretch, even just talking about this. But when does the Course ever not totally stretch us? If we could just get closer to this bar, we would have so much more love and joining, the kind that we're all looking for, the kind that we all want. If anything, we can all realize that the ways that the ego's voice have taught us to search for these things, to search for love and joining in our lives, is nicely designed to fail. After all, the ego's teaching when it comes to the search for love is seek and do not find. While the Holy Spirit is saying that we will find love by being love. And doesn't that make a lot more sense? So I hope that you have found these 4 phases to be as powerful as we have. Again, just to wrap it up, or to recap rather, phase 1 is where the ego's voice is all you can hear. You're on the ego bus and it's got both hands on the wheel. In phase 2, you're managing the ego's voice, but you still sincerely think it's right. In phase 3, you've distanced yourself from the ego's voice. You've pulled it up at the root and you're able to let it go. And that's what makes room for phase 4, where you're able to hear the Holy Spirit's voice more clearly. And like Jesus, who is our teacher after all, you're able to teach only love as a result. It's a Jesus level state of spiritual advancement to be in phase 4 all the time. But as we say so often here, just even having that as a goal will take you so much further than you ever would have gone before. And so to close here, we obviously all want to make relationships work, but I hope that you can see that to the extent that our solutions involve leaving our ego voice not only intact, but empowered, will always leave us in a state of dysfunction. And that's what we're seeing all around us. Clearly, one of the biggest problems in our world right now is that we are becoming less and less able to speak to one another when we disagree. We're becoming less and less able to engage with and understand one another. And we're becoming less and less able to forgive and see the good in one another. And we're less and less able to do these things because we're spending more and more time listening to the ego's voice, which is always going to lead us to this place. And so that's what we need to understand most about the ego. It can't lead us anywhere else but chaos. Separation is the ego's ballgame. Its function is to destroy. That's all it's doing here. There's a place in the Course where it says, hell is the ego's goal. And we can see from everything that we've covered that that's true. How do you know you're listening to the ego's voice? It's pretty simple, really. When your mind is in hell. And as a result of your mind being in hell, your relationships will be in shambles. But that's the very problem A Course in Miracles came to help us solve. It came to help us get along, to show us a better way to get along. It came to teach us how to heal dysfunction. But in order to do that, in order to actually demonstrate that better way, we need to become different people. We need to become the people who can override the ego's voice in our mind and shine truth into the world. In other words, we need to become people who can actually get along. As Robert mentioned in the intro, it is kind of amazing that the spiritual community is often not much better at this than anyone else, but we should be. If spiritual wisdom is the highest the world has to offer, then spiritual people should be the ones the world is looking to for the template of how to get along. I heard Marianne Williamson say a few years ago that relationships are the new spiritual frontier, and I deeply believe that is true. Deep relational work is spiritual work. God, how I wish we understood that. And from a Course perspective, our greatest spiritual achievement will only come as we get the ego's voice out of our head and see each other truly. The world doesn't have to be this way. We can write different endings to our love stories. We can have relationships that work, relationships where love and joining lasts, and where together we experience real spiritual growth. But we can only do that if we stop allowing the ego's voice to write our stories for us. Thank you.